All right, great. So my name is Kait McIntyre. I'm with Anti-War Committee Chicago and Freedom Road Socialist Organization, and I'm one of your MCs for tonight. I first of all want to thank Grace Place for letting us use the space to hold this event. Also Mike Kalis from Multiculti for lending us the camera so we could film this event, and for everyone here for coming tonight. The time during Operation Protective Edge was difficult for everyone dedicated to a free Palestine and passionate about human rights. While mainstream news refused to cover it, brave reporters and publications like Abunimah and the Electronic Intifada, as well as courageous people in Gaza, showed us daily the atrocities committed by Israel against the Palestinian people. The light that shone through these dark days was the incredible amount of organizing done by the Palestinian community and its supporters that refused to allow Israel to normalize the occupation and disrupted business as usual for the companies that are profiting off of it. Before I turn it over to my co-MC Nesreen, I want to commemorate that on September 24th, 2010, 4 years ago, the FBI raided the homes of several anti-war and pro-Palestine activists in the Midwest. Two of them are here tonight, Joe Osbaker and Hatem Abudaya. Joe and Hatem inspired not just me, but many in Chicago with their courage and refusal to back down in the face of FBI repression and intimidation. Now I'm going to turn it over to Nesreen, who's going to tell you what the Midwest 23 and their supporters are working to defend.
Thank you, Kait. Hello everybody, my name is Nesreen Hasan. I am a member of USPCN Chicago. We are here tonight to discuss the victory in Gaza, but even though there's a current ceasefire in Gaza, I just want to stress all Palestinians are still living under occupation, apartheid, and still under the siege. Just as Israel tries to continue to repress Palestinians' rights in Palestine, our community here also faces repression. Kait touched on the Midwest 23, and I just also want to say that 7 of those Midwest of the 23 are Palestinian. I also want to discuss another case real quickly of a form of FBI and political repression here, and that is the case of Rasmiya Oda. On October 22nd, 2013, Rasmiya Oda, the Associate Director of the Arab American Action Network, was arrested by DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and was charged with unlawful procurement of naturalization for allegedly giving inaccurate information on a citizenship application she filed about 20 years ago. They are claiming she did not disclose that she spent 10 years in an Israeli prison in Palestine. Her conviction by an Israeli military court was forced by vicious physical and sexual torture. So she and we do not acknowledge that illegal imprisonment. And neither should the U.S. court. Rasmiya has been a community leader for decades, and her life's work is supporting the empowerment of Arab women. She has worked with disenfranchised Arab women in Palestine, Lebanon, and Jordan, and now here in Chicago. She founded the AWC, which is the Arab Women's Committee of the AAAN, which has over 600 members. So the question is, why is the government looking at an application that is over 20 years old? We believe it is because Rasmiya is being targeted for who she is and who we are. Palestinians that criticize U.S. support of Israel and organize to change foreign policy here. We are asking people to show their support for this community icon by signing the petition over there that we're sending out right now. And also, if you have a Facebook, we're asking you guys to like the page, drop the charges against Rasmiya. And we're also asking people to attend her motion hearing October 2nd and her trial on November 4th. Both are in Detroit because that's where she applied for citizenship. It is very important that the judge knows that she has massive support behind her. Your presence in the courtroom will make a big difference. We have a carpool sheet going around as well, also on the table, for you to come and join us. This is a case of repression against Palestinians that is happening in our own backyard. So please come out and support Rasmiya Oda. So now we're going to get into program. I'm going to introduce our first guest, who you all know. It's Abunimah. He is a world-renowned Palestinian journalist and writer. He is the co-founder and editor of the Electronic Intifada, has written hundreds of articles on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, including the first book, One Country, A Bold Proposal to End the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. and in 2014 released his second book, The Battle for Justice in Palestine. He has appeared on many television discussion programs, including Democracy Now! He's appeared on CNN, MSNBC, PBS, and other networks. Based in the United States, he has been an active part of the movement for justice in Palestine for 20 years. Please welcome Ali Abunimah.
It's wonderful to be here, and we have an amazing panel tonight. I'm really honored to be speaking on this, sharing this platform with activists who are in the thick of the battle for justice in Palestine and the battle for justice in the United States, which is integral to it. And this weekend I was in San Diego for the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation organizers conference, and it was the first meeting that I attended since the attack on Gaza, and it was so important psychologically and spiritually to be with people who are engaging in the fight for justice here, and I feel very much the same being with you tonight. We need to be together, we need to gather together regularly in order to sustain our strength for this battle ahead. The situation in Gaza remains catastrophic, and that makes me hesitate to use the word victory, not because I don't see that there was a victory in Gaza. There was a victory in that the Palestinian resistance withstood the Israeli assault heroically for 51 days, and those 51 days came after years of standing up to Israeli resistance, withstanding the siege. And the fight that Palestinians fought against the Israeli army was a legitimate fight. Palestinians are entitled to defend themselves. They're entitled to fight back. They're entitled to resist, as any other people in the world is entitled to resist. But we have come to a situation where we are, it's drummed into us that we should be afraid to say that, because the Palestinians are the only people denied this right. We live in a world where the US, the CIA, all the intelligence services are saying, let's arm this group, let's arm that group. Today we're fighting, last September we were about to bomb the regime of Bashar al-Assad. This year we're going to bomb its enemies. Next year, who knows who will be bombing. Maybe we'll be bombing the people we're arming now. We don't know. The Palestinians are the only people, though, who are exempt from the notion that they have the right to defend themselves, the right to seek and accept assistance in their self-defense and resistance. In fact, assisting Palestinian resistance is criminalized in this country and other countries around the world. So I want to start by saying that. Yet the cost of Palestinian resistance, like the cost of non-resistance, is high when you have an enemy like Israel. 2,100 people, more than 2,100 people were massacred, including at least 521 children. More than 11,000 people were injured, physically injured. And these are people who will have, many of them, thousands of whom will need years of rehabilitation and will live with lifelong disabilities in a context where there is very little infrastructure and services for people with disabilities in Gaza. In fact, the only rehabilitation hospital in Gaza, the only fully equipped rehabilitation hospital, was deliberately targeted and bombed by Israel during this massacre. So, as a way to compound the injury and the suffering over many years. By my calculations, Israel dropped the equivalent of an atomic bomb on Gaza in the space of 51 days. Thousands and thousands of kilotons, thousands and thousands of tons of high explosives. The vast majority of them, it must be said, contrary to the propaganda, Israel doesn't use, again, they use some of these pinpoint laser-guided bombs, but the vast majority of what Israel uses are inaccurate artillery shells, heavy artillery shells. They're devastating. They spray, one shell can spray thousands of pieces of shrapnel. That's why the injuries are so horrific. But they're very inaccurate, and entire neighborhoods were deliberately pounded with huge amounts of artillery. It's important to note that this massacre, while of course the Israelis were the ones firing the missiles and the artillery and the bombs and so on, they had many accomplices. Those accomplices include, of course, the United States first and foremost, and Barack Obama personally, who had, and I say personally because he is perhaps one of the only people on this planet who could have pulled the plug on this Israeli attack, who could have said, no, we're not going to resupply them, we're going to send a strong message this would stop. But instead, the Obama administration made sure to resupply Israel while it was massacring whole families in Gaza, while it was bombing apartment buildings, bombing schools, and bombing clinics. Barack Obama, with his word, could have stopped those missiles and bombs from going out of the US weapons stores that are pre-positioned in Israel to the Israeli army. But he made an affirmative choice to continue to assist Israel to kill those children. So I think personal accountability, which is something the president preaches, is something that we should attribute and demand to him. But of course, he is part of a system and a government that is dedicated to assisting Israel's slaughter of Palestinians and assisting Israel's robbery of Palestinian land. The suffering is far from over. In recent days and weeks, horrifying mass murders have been committed at sea. There was the case of the boat of 500 people, of which it's estimated that the majority were Palestinians who fled from the devastation in Gaza, was deliberately sunk in the Mediterranean. This wasn't a tragedy at sea, it wasn't a shipwreck, it wasn't a storm. The accounts from the very few survivors that have been collected by the International Organization for Migration show that this boat was deliberately sunk by the smugglers. So it was a mass murder that is second only to 9/11 in terms of the scale of a mass murder using mass transportation. But we're not even talking about it. It's barely registered in the conscience of the world. And of course, more and more people are being driven to sea, thrown into the sea by Israel, because the situation in Gaza remains so desperate. Now, the news today, for those who have been following it, is that Hamas and Fatah have come up with yet another agreement, and yet another unity agreement, to reactivate their unity government in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. And I was asked about this earlier today on Al Jazeera. Will this succeed? Will it work? Why is it happening? So I just want to say something about that. Of course, all Palestinians want unity. Nobody prefers to be divided. But this unity agreement, just like all the dozens of previous ones signed, will sadly not go very far, because the basic contradiction remains in place, a contradiction that was only underscored in the recent Israeli massacre on Gaza and the events leading up to it, which I'll say something about in a few minutes. But let's remember that on one side of this deal, you have Hamas, which is the largest among a number of Palestinian resistance factions that were engaged in a battle, a military battle with Gaza, that engaged the Israeli army using sophisticated guerrilla tactics and inflicted heavy losses on Israel. Comparatively, I mean, we saw the Israeli losses in Gaza reaching the kinds of levels that Israel faced when it invaded Lebanon in 2006 and was stopped in its tracks by Hezbollah. And on the other side, so that's one side of the unity deal, where Hamas and the other resistance factions were engaged in war. On the other side is the Palestinian Authority of Mahmoud Abbas, which throughout this whole period continued its active collaboration with the Israeli army, the Shin Bet, and the security services to dismantle and discredit and crush Palestinian resistance. So there is no basis, and I don't believe, I've never believed in beating about the bush on these things, there is no basis for unity between a resistance movement and a proxy militia that is on the side of the occupation in practice, regardless of the highfalutin rhetoric about Palestinian rights and sovereignty and goodness knows what that you're going to hear from Mahmoud Abbas at the United Nations tomorrow. If you listen, I probably won't. But words are one thing, it's deeds that count. And the deeds are that the Palestinian Authority continues its full-throated embrace of the Israeli occupation. So there will not be a harmonious unity government. But nonetheless, what's the impetus for this? I think it's clear from the perspective of Hamas and people in Gaza that they need the siege to be lifted. And among the terms that were supposedly agreed in this movement, in this agreement today, is that the Abbas forces would be brought back to the Gaza-Egypt border to monitor the crossings. So, in a sense, you would have an Israeli proxy militia running the border crossings, which would make Egypt, of course the Egyptian military regime is allied with Israel, and so these are Israeli and Egyptian conditions that you have a proxy militia that they're comfortable with running the crossings as a condition for lifting the siege. So as far as I see, that's the only or the main reason why Hamas would agree to such a deal. I think they would have to be very careful. I mean, we saw that the guerrilla resistance in Gaza was able to surprise Israel militarily. The Israeli army were unaware of the extent of the preparations that had taken place because of the tight security that the resistance would have to operate in Gaza. And so I think they would be very unlikely to allow the Palestinian Authority, which is allied and cooperating with Israeli army intelligence, to go much beyond manning the border crossings. We'll have to see. But let's say the ingredients are not there for a harmonious unity government. And what that means for us is we have to continue to put pressure and to amplify the voices of those in Gaza who are saying, end the siege. Because what is being planned now, I mean, in the month, it will be a month tomorrow, or a month tomorrow since the ceasefire, almost nothing has changed on the crossings. Yet a few more trucks are coming in, but construction supplies are not coming in. We've heard from doctors, we've reported on the electronic Intifada, that medical supplies are being held up by Egypt. And so almost nothing has changed. And so the victory, in the sense of being able to withstand this assault, is at risk if Abbas and Israel and the United States and the Egyptian dictatorship are allowed to reimpose the siege or to maintain the siege in a new form. So ending the siege has to remain one of our focuses. I just say briefly that the situation in Gaza has been so dire that, in a sense, it's overshadowed what has happened in the West Bank. But in the West Bank, things are worse than ever. I mean, in my book, The Battle for Justice in Palestine, I talk about this myth that was fed to us for many years of the booming West Bank, of Salam Fayyad building a paradise with shopping malls and cinemas and all of this. And this mirage has disappeared, and what's left is a situation where Palestinians face ever accelerating land theft by Israel, brutal repression by the Israeli army, and brutal repression by the Palestinian Authority, which is closely allied with it. Since the start of this year, more than 40 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank. This is 4 times as many as in the same period last year. That's just one measure. I hate to reduce lives to numbers, but that's one measure of the escalation in violence. And children have been the primary targets. This weekend in San Diego, we heard a very moving speech from Tariq Abu Khdair, the young Palestinian teen who was brutally tortured by the Israelis, and it was caught on video. And he said the only reason I'm standing here in San Diego and all my cousins are still in prison is because I'm an American citizen and there was a video of what happened to me. But many of his cousins have been in prison for long months. And of course his cousin Muhammad Abu Khdair, his cousin and friend, was murdered, was lynched. He was kidnapped by Israeli settlers, forced to drink gasoline and set on fire. And by the way, there's video. We have a really great video of Tariq's speech and his mother, which I'm going to try and get up onto the electronic Intifada in the next day or two. And it's a really moving speech. But it highlights the targeting of children. And here I think Jennifer Bing from AFSC has some information on the No Way to Treat a Child campaign, which is starting up, which is an attempt to focus on the military detention and torture of children. And that's a campaign everyone can get involved in. Some people were saying to me, you know, let's talk about what we can do tonight. One of the things we can do is be part of the No Way to Treat a Child campaign. So see Jennifer, who's right there on the side later. Oh, yeah, but do you have the
Yeah.
Okay, so that's some material on the No Way to Treat a Child campaign. And of course, the violence against Muhammad and Tariq and so many other children came in the context of the rampage, which the Israeli government launched in the West Bank in June after the the past few months feels like years, but it was in June only that Israel launched this rampage under the pretext of looking for the 3 Israeli youths who were kidnapped and later found dead. And now what's critical about this, we talk about and we focus on the contempt for the lives of Palestinian children that Israel has. But, you know, in my view, children are children. You know, a child is a child. All children deserve protection. And let's remember that Israel used those Israeli children in the most despicable way. The Israeli government lied to their families. The Israelis knew from the first day that those 2 children and the young man who was 19, the 3 youths from the settlements, had been killed. But they lied to their mothers, and they told them, no, your sons are still alive and we're going to bring them home. And they told the Israeli public that. And that was an excuse to carry out the largest invasion of West Bank towns and cities since 2002. So Israel is as cynical and as contemptuous for the lives of Israeli children as it is for Palestinian children. And just 2 days ago, Israel carried out the extrajudicial murder, the extrajudicial execution of the 2 men it claims were responsible for the abduction and murder of the 3 Israeli youths. There was no attempt to arrest them. There was no pretense of a trial. We will never learn the truth of what really happened because Israel decided to carry out an extrajudicial execution. And the same so-called, in any case, the chances of a fair trial would have been nil. The same so-called courts, the military tribunals Israel runs, is the same system in which Rasmiya Odeh was tortured and raped before she was convicted. So there's no justice for Palestinians, while the perpetrators of the murder of Muhammad Abu Khudayr are treated under the most lenient conditions. I just want to say something about, really, in the last few minutes, talk about the context we face here in the United States. What was striking about Muhammad Abu Khudayr, the young boy who was lynched and murdered, is that in the hours after he was lynched, the Israeli police, now we knew then, but now we know without any doubt, that he was kidnapped and murdered by Israelis. But in the hours after his body was found mutilated and burned in the Jerusalem forest, the Israeli police themselves started spreading rumors that he was killed. This was an honor killing because he was gay. This is complete fabrications that the Israeli police themselves were spreading and Israeli media was spreading to blame Muhammad's own family for his killing. And Muhammad's father said, "They killed my son twice. First, they burned him, and the second time with these disgusting lies." And this just strikes me as such a familiar lament that perhaps the parents of Michael Brown in Ferguson would readily identify with. And the loved ones of so many black men and women in this country, including Trayvon Martin and Renisha McBride, and I don't know if you saw the horrifying video that was released yesterday of a man whose name, I'm not sure if his name is reported, sorry? Justin Crawford, the man who was shot for no reason, just getting out of his car at a gas station. A police officer just, I mean, the video is there, nobody could deny it. And this is a reminder that every black man in this country is not safe anywhere at any time. As we say in Gaza, there's no safe place. In Gaza, there's no safe place in this country, particularly for African American men. But for our African American brothers and sisters in general, this country seems to be becoming more, not less, hostile. Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Renisha McBride, and so many others, like Muhammad Abu Khudayr, were put on trial after their deaths by racist media and by public officials looking for supposed imperfections in their characters that would justify their brutal murders and exonerate those who killed them. When we compare what's happened in Ferguson, and we don't need to go as far as Ferguson, we can start here in Chicago, and what is happening in Palestine, as many have done, we're not talking about mere analogies. We're talking about organic, financial, political, and ideological connections between what happens here and what happens in Palestine. And in the book here I talk about the militarization of policing, mass incarceration, the conveyor belt of police officials and police chiefs who go to Israel for training and cooperation with Israel's brutal and racist occupation. And the Chicago Police Department have been on at least 2 major delegations. Virtually all the top brass in the Chicago Police Department from every division have been to Israel on Israel lobby-sponsored delegations. So this is real, and it's happening now. And what is happening is the testing of weapon systems and systems of oppression on Palestinians that are then sold to police forces around the country. Israel didn't invent racism. Let's be clear about that. America does not need any lessons from Israel in racism. But Israel is providing technologies of oppression that then get laundered as foreign expertise, tested in the tough neighborhood of the Middle East. And firms in this country and in Israel are reaping huge profits from this. And this is also true with border militarization and mass deportation. Maybe we'll have time to go into that in the Q&A, but I won't now because I want to wrap up. And just to say that what was amazing at the conference in San Diego, the US campaign conference, and these discussions are happening here among us on campuses, is about the amazing advances the Palestine Solidarity Movement, in particular the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, have made in the past 3-5 years. And there's a lot of work ahead of us. But also, we are facing unprecedented resistance and counterattacks from the Israel lobby. And again, we don't have to go far for that. Many of us are supporting and traveling to Detroit with Rasmiya Odeh, or taking part in events here in Chicago, and more of us should do that. And as the trial approaches, the support of every single person is going to matter. Stephen Salaita, the professor, he's coming to Chicago in October. There are flyers here about him, and I've been following and reporting on his case and the cover-up at the University of Illinois. Today, I filed a request with the public access counselor of the Illinois Attorney General to ask for investigation into the university's apparent destruction of public records that I believe would shed light on the influence of major pro-Israel donors on the decision to fire Stephen Salaita. I believe there is evidence of a cover-up, and I'm going to do all I can to get to the bottom of it. And as Stephen Salaita approaches, and there's an interesting connection here, because I know that it's been 4 years almost to the day since the raids in Chicago and Minneapolis, and of course, who was ultimately behind that here in Chicago was Patrick Fitzgerald, the U.S. attorney at the time. Well, today Patrick Fitzgerald is no longer a U.S. attorney, but he is a trustee of the University of Illinois. And when I went down to Illinois, to Urbana a couple of weeks ago for the trustees meeting, and I confronted him with my video camera, he was, let's say, an uncooperative witness. But I wrote to Patrick Fitzgerald this morning, and I said to him, I presented him with the evidence that it's published. I didn't send him anything I haven't already published, and said, here is the evidence of a cover-up, what you would call obstruction of justice, what you'd send people to prison for, and now you're a trustee of the University of Illinois. Are you going to protect the people involved in this cover-up, or are you going to protect the public trust? So let's see what Patrick Fitzgerald would do now that he's on the other side. Is he going to conspire with the Chancellor and the President and the other officials of the University of Illinois in this cover-up? Or is he going to actually fulfill his oath as a trustee? just end by saying that we're at a moment where it would be really easy to succumb to despair about everything that is happening in Palestine and everything that is happening particularly in Gaza. But let's remember what people in Gaza themselves have asked us to do. They have not asked us to despair. They have said, redouble your efforts. Double down on boycott, divestment, and sanctions. That's what we want you to do. That's how you can make sure there isn't another massacre. And just 2 days ago, there was a group of activists in Glasgow, in Scotland, who shut down one of the drone factories for which is making the Israeli model drone for the UK government. They shut it down for a whole day. They chained themselves to the gates. They occupied the roof. It was a great action. And they said, this was our first response to the call from Gaza to escalate our efforts, and more is coming, and more needs to come.
Thank you, honey. I just want to make 3 announcements. One announcement is Joe passed around the carpool sheet to come to the October 2nd motion hearing for the SMEA.
No, where is it?
Yeah, if anybody has the clipboard, if they want to raise their hand.
Yeah.
Oh, it's right over there in that corner. So it is going around. And then second is that we have empty seats over here. So if you guys, we have like about 5 empty seats. So anybody in the back, feel free to sit up here. And then last, after the panelists are done speaking, it will be time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please save it till the end after all the panelists are done speaking. I'm now going to introduce our next panelist. Her name is Manar Daghash. She's a member of USPCN Chicago, which is a Palestinian American organization based on grassroots. She is a youth activist, and she is part of the AAAN's campaign to end law enforcement harassment and end racial profiling. Please welcome Manar Daghash.
Just a quick statement. I don't know why whenever I'm asked to do like a performance or like a speech or something, they always put me up with the greats who are much more experienced than I am, but I'll aside. Hello everyone. My name is Manar Daghash and I'm a 17-year-old member of the Chicago chapter of USPCN. It was once said that those who love peace must organize as effectively as those who love war. For decades, Palestinians have been denied their fundamental rights of freedom and equality through the ethnic cleansing, racial discrimination, colonization, and military occupation of Israel. Despite much disapproval of Israeli policies by the UN and other international bodies and human rights organizations, the U.S. and its allies have kept the world community from holding Israel accountable and enforcing adherence to basic principles of law. Israel's crimes have continued with exemption from punishment. In the aftermath of Israel's military slaughter of civilians in Gaza and the continued occupation and apartheid in the rest of Palestine, the victorious declaration that the Palestinian people will win may seem delusional and hyperbolic. But it is not a rhetorical device. It is a moral argument ingrained in a reading of anti-colonial history. Israel has terrorized the world, manipulated the anti-Arab sentiment, and attacked its critics to justify its unjustifiable occupation. It was this most recent increase of inhumane force that resulted in a tipping point in world public opinion to disapprove of Israel's neglect of human rights and support the right of sovereignty of the Palestinian people. The U.S. Community Network works to empower our communities, unify our voice, and affirm the rights of Palestinians to self-determination and equality through ending Israeli occupation and colonization of all historic Palestine. It was this level of unity, organization, positivity, and commitment that was manifested in Palestine, in the U.S., and throughout the world, and that was represented by USPCN that resulted in the victory of Gaza. This was a movement of the people. Amongst the chaos, we never forgot who we were. Yes, many were killed, but the Palestinian spirit is not dead and will never die. Yes, the oppressors controlled our borders and worldly matters, but we never forgot what mattered. Israel clearly lost this battle on both military and political levels. One of the strongest armies in the world could not accomplish its goal of disarming and defeating the unified Palestinian resistance in Gaza. All the Palestinian resistance groups participated together in the defense of our land, and prove that Israel's military is not invincible. Palestinians and Arabs led the forces of resistance by any and all means, including the mass Arab and Muslim mobilizations in this country, the largest ever of our people. USPCN led coalitional efforts in many of the cities where we have chapters, such as New York, Detroit, the Bay Area, Chicago, St. Louis, Youngstown, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. Locally in Chicago, we were one of the core members of the Coalition for Justice in Palestine and played a key role in organizing the protests that reached over 10,000 people in the streets of Chicago. We worked to bring the voice of solidarity expressed by other oppressed communities at our rallies, including the Black, Latino, and Puerto Rican communities as speakers. We drew a parallel between the Ferguson uprising and the Gaza resistance by taking part in the delegation that went to Ferguson and met with people on the ground leading the work for justice for Mike Brown. We recognize the essential political connection that must be made between oppressed nationalities in the U.S. and the people of Palestine. Through the work of USPCN and other Palestinian forces in the U.S. and around the world, the commitment and unity of the people and growing international support, the victory in Palestine seems inevitable. For the Palestinian and Arabs in the room that are interested in USPCN's work and are interested in joining us, we invite you to our next meeting that's on Tuesday, September 30th at 7 p.m. at Jerusalem Banquets. If you're interested, have any questions, comments, or anything, please approach me. It's at 8310 South Harlem. All right, so if you have any questions or just want to approach me, you're welcome to approach me after.
Thank you, Manar. Next panelist is Marjana Abu Khalil. She is the president of UIC's chapter for Students for Justice in Palestine, the largest student movement on campuses around the country. SJP is the face of the BDS movement. Following the Gaza war, the University of Illinois is where the first major struggle against repression of the Palestinian support movement has emerged. Marjana will speak about Professor Stephen Salaita and his fight for academic freedom. Please welcome Marjana Abu Khalil.
As Ali has spoke a little bit about the Stephen Salaita case, I kind of just like to give you a little bit of the basics of the case before I get into my four main points. So, for those of you who don't know Professor Stephen Salaita, he was a tenured faculty member of the at Virginia Tech. He taught in the English department there. Stephen Salaita went through a rigorous hiring process through the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He was hired through the department there. It was the American Indian Studies department. And basically through the chancellor, he was kind of promised that he was supposed to get the board of approval by the board of trustees at the university. So it's not unusual for the professor to start teaching there at the university before they get that seal of the board of trustees. Now, granted, Stephen had signed his contract, so he was fired without due process, which is completely illegal. My main points that I'd like to speak on are the impact of the mobilization, its impact on freedom of speech, the hiring at UIC, and the case for Palestine. So I speak to you now not just as a student of the University of Illinois, but as a Palestinian student activist. So a lot of times when you hear about this case, you'll just hear about it in terms of free speech or academic freedom, but Stephen Salaita was not just fired because of his tweets, he was fired because of his tweets about Palestine, and I want to make that very clear. He was speaking about Israel's heinous acts the heinous acts that Israel has committed against the Palestinians. So I don't want to take this out of context, so that is the main reason why he was fired. My first main point would be on the mobilization. So this controversy has mobilized more faculty than we've ever seen in the U.S., or that we've ever seen in U.S. history, because of the firing of Salaita has basically violated the most cherished values of public education. So namely the process of firing, hiring, and tenure. Faculty within the departments and the dean's office are responsible for determining which faculty are qualified for these positions. So Stephen was actually qualified for this position. He obtained the position with the department's approval, with the dean's approval, but was ultimately rejected by the Board of Trustees and the Chancellor, which completely goes against due process because they do not really have the authority to judge Stephen on his academic quality of education or as an educator. The Dean's Office is responsible for determining these decisions, and after going through this intense process, he was hired through the standard hiring procedures, and pro-Israeli external pressure groups supported by the Chancellor and the Board of Trustees were seen as a major threat to a major reason why he was fired. The academics seem to not be really in charge of this situation. It seems like it's more of a politician and business agenda going on here. It's basically an attack on public education, and it opens up the possibility for banks and politicians to determine the faculty, the hiring and firing of faculty. This is why the case has mobilized more academics to take a stance.